Hard to think of a better time than now to discuss the question of whether and how we need to reimagine the way we are governed. In Australia and around the world, the challenges that governments have to address today, from climate change to rising inequality to creating economies that work for people, can seem overwhelming. And it helps to explain why a lot of polling suggests that trust in governments and in their capacity to improve the lives of citizens is at an all-time low. Yet one of the remarkable features of this COVID-19 crisis is that in recent months, trust in and satisfaction with many governments and leaders, not all, has risen sharply. Surely that indicates that the public reservoir of goodwill is not dry, that the public still believes that governments matter. To discuss these and other questions, we have a great panel today. Terry Moran is one of Australia's most distinguished former public servants. He has been Secretary of Victoria's Department of Premier and Cabinet and of Australia's Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet, serving under Prime Ministers Kevin Rudd and Julia Gillard. In his current role as Chair of the Centre for Policy Development, Terry continues to think deeply and write often about how government should work. And so does Catherine Althouse. Catherine is Deputy Dean of the Australian New Zealand School of Government and the ANZOG Chair of Public Service Leadership and Reform at the University of New South Wales. Catherine has taught and researched in Canada, and she also writes very thoughtfully with a wide range on how to reinvent public services for these times. Finally, Thea Snow is a former public servant here in Victoria with the Department of Premier and Cabinet. Thea has recently returned to Melbourne after working with the Innovation Foundation Nesta in the United Kingdom. She's now working here at the Centre for Public Impact, and it's an article that Thea wrote recently on the Enablement Paradigm that forms the basis of these webinars, and particularly the webinar that we're hosting tonight. The first question is, why do we need to reimagine government? What does this term mean to you? Second, can government be reimagined in a way that empowers communities and citizens? 3, how can a reimagining of government help us to address our great challenges, including climate change, the place of nation states in a globalised world, and how to create and share prosperity in a time of rising inequality? 4, can you offer some tangible examples of governments who are experimenting with reimagining of government? 5, how does a reimagining of government work at this time in the context of COVID-19? And finally, 6, how do we align reimagining of government with all the other things that governments have to address? Risk, ensuring an equitable distribution of resources, and keeping their budgets balanced. So there's going to be a very short period of silence while you all vote, and then I will present those questions to our panel. Okay, we've now done the poll, and in fact, one question that interesting, people have gone straight to the concrete, which is really interesting. Very popular question was question 4. Can you offer tangible examples of governments who are experimenting with a reimagining of government? Terry, I think this is a great question for you to address. You've been in government for many years and you still watch government very closely. Tell me about governments you see in Australia and around the world who are actually doing innovative things in reimagining the way they are working.
Well, I think you can find some of it in some departments of the Commonwealth Government. You can find it similarly in some departments of the New South Wales and Victorian governments. And a good example would be the trial in the city of Wyndham, west of the centre of Melbourne. It's in the western suburbs of Melbourne, to come up with a new approach to provide coordinated services to help refugees get employment. And it's been very successful, and it's suggested new ways in which you can organise to deliver services, but at the end of the day, authority to deliver them rests at the local level, and there isn't an iron link back into Spring Street or Canberra so that even minor decisions can be taken at that level. And I think this is the future of much delivery of services, and a good example of well-tried approaches that have worked over a long period are, for instance, public hospitals. They do it differently in various states, but all now have gone towards much more independence in their management and government, with boards, chief executives, clear budgets, activity-based funding, and strong accountability. And you could replicate the elements of that approach in quite a number of areas. And I think that we've got to have a much stronger debate about how to do those sorts of things, because the old-fashioned hierarchical, centrally controlled department structures just aren't working.
So Terry, before I throw this to Catherine and Thea, can you just say a bit more about Wyndham? What is it about Wyndham that is new and is innovative in your view? And for that Wyndham trial to be expanded more broadly, what would have to change at government at the higher levels, at the central level, to, in a sense, to take the risk, I suppose, of driving decision-making down to a lower level of government?
Well, CPD and the Boston Consulting Group did a major piece of work on how we could do better by refugees. And it was outlined in a report called Settling Better. We then approached the CEO at Wyndham and said, well, if we could get the money, would you be interested in running a trial? So we went off to prominent foundations, the Myer Foundation and the Vincent Fairfax Family Trust, and they were very generous in their funding for us to get this going. There was a lot of early uncertainty, but there were some terrific people at Wyndham on the ground who knew how to do things. And when it comes to getting people who are facing obstacles into jobs, as obstacles that refugees face, they knew that, one, you've got to be able to activate local networks to get jobs, because you can't do it with some sort of computing system that will automatically put people in contact with employers. And secondly, you've got to have other associated services, skills, learning English, perhaps help with housing, perhaps even assistance in knowing how to negotiate banks and shopping centres and all that sort of stuff. And Wyndham quickly found scores of jobs for refugees in that area that had been having great difficulty. And so we've extended it to discussions in New South Wales, including in the city of Fairfield, and Commonwealth ministers and state ministers have been to Wyndham to visit the site. And I think that it's just a small scale version of what's been going for a long time, which is how do you run efficient public hospitals, which, by the way, in Australia at the moment are more efficient than their private sector counterparts.
That's really interesting. We might come back to that in a moment, Terry. Thea, this sounds very similar to the work that you've been doing on the enablement paradigm. I'm struck by some of the things that Terry talked about, the centering of services in a place, and because the people who are in the place know more about what they need and what can be delivered on the ground. I wonder if you could say a bit about what the enablement paradigm is, and perhaps provide some concrete examples of it, of where it's working either here or around the world.
Yeah, sure. So the enablement paradigm is really, I think, fundamentally about an acknowledgement of the fact that the world that we're operating in is complex. And like Terry said, when you're talking about refugee settlement, you know, it's so multifaceted. There are so many bits of the puzzle that need to be addressed in order to make the change that you want to change. And what we believe at CPI is that the version of government that can best support people is a version of government that doesn't think about how can we control the levers and how can we deliver services to people and do things to people, but rather a version of government that identifies that there are great assets already that exist within communities. And so the role of government becomes an enabler of communities, and it shifts to a model where the role of government is to help communities thrive rather than tell them what to do. And there's a power dynamic that shifts with that. So it's around different ways of engaging with community, as Terry just described. And it's also a mindset shift within government. So it's not just about changing systems and structures, it's also about changing beliefs and values and principles. And I think that Hilary Cottam, who has written Radical Help, which is a wonderful book that everyone should read, describes it really nicely when she says, and I'm actually going to read it so that I get it right. She says, the role of public servant in what we describe as being the enablement paradigm is no longer that of controlling the mechanical levers. It is that of head gardener, setting out the design, planting, tending, nurturing, and where necessary, weeding. And I think that's a beautiful analogy to describe the role of government as Terry just described and as we see it as well.
It is a lovely metaphor, but is it happening? Can you cite some examples of it happening?
Yeah, I think it is happening. I actually had a fantastic conversation. So I can think of some examples overseas, but sometimes that feels a bit abstract and it feels far away from Australia. But I had a fantastic conversation just the other day with some people from DHHS who are doing some work on what they call the social landlord framework. So it's a new model of community regeneration in public housing. And they're thinking really deeply about their role as enablers of those communities, and they're having different kinds of conversations. So they're not treating community engagement as a sort of tick box consultation exercise. They're hosting basketball games and hosting meals, and through those types of interactions are able to have completely different conversations than you can when you invite people into a round table that's intimidating and full of people who are really different from the community that they're working with. And so it's I think this social landlord framework is a really great example of how to have different conversations, how to engage communities in a co-design process, asking them what's working really well for you, what's not working so well, and what changes would you like to see, and co-designing a program of work and then involving the community in the delivery and the implementation of that program of work as well. So I think that's I'm sure there are many examples of that are happening on the ground in sort of little spots all over Australia, but that's just one that came to my attention the other day.
Thanks, Hilary. And when we get to the chat with the participants in the webinar, people might themselves offer examples of projects they know that are happening. Catherine, I'm going to throw to you on this question. I've read some of your papers now, and it strikes me that your range is broad. You write very imaginatively about reshaping Australian governance based on landscape and environment rather than on states, for example. I found that a very interesting paper. But you've also written practically, if I can use that term, in that you and another public servant, Carmel McGregor, produced a submission to a review of the Australian Public Service that has been underway in this year. So can you address the question of examples of, do you believe this kind of change is afoot, or are you more sceptical in the Australian public service context? What is happening there, and what would you like to see happen further?
Thanks, James. I think I'd probably make the first point that there's something for us to think about. I was struck when Thea was speaking that there's this notion of the reimagination of government, but I think in terms of where we've located in the Australia and New Zealand place, that we have the opportunity to rediscover, actually, even more than reimagine, because of the wealth of First Peoples wisdom in the space. And that's why I've got a particular interest in that notion of linking in with landscape, because I think a very practical example I can speak to, which is in the New Zealand context, is the Whanganui River, which has recently been given legal status in New Zealand law. So it's a very practical but very new way of thinking about how we treat the environment and deal with intergenerational equity and intergenerational stewardship, but based on very old principles that come from First Peoples and the wealth of their expertise, if you like, which is very much similar to what the Centre for Public Impact and Thea are doing in terms of talking about the enabling paradigm. I'm struck that there's the leadership, servant stewardship sort of idea that's promoted there, the relationality, a whole range of the aspects, the humility. Those are issues that are actually very fundamental to Indigenous forms of leadership that have been practiced in this region of the world for many, many thousands of years. But to get back to your question about practical examples then in the Australian space, I guess Carmel and I did a bit of a review. There have been many initiatives that have been attempted in the Australian scene, but I think where we're a little bit more sceptical is that we've heard these initiatives for many years now, but we haven't seen a radical transformation take place of our institutions. So in the Australian scene, I think there's more that we can be doing actually in the space. And this is probably linked to what Thea and Terry have been talking about, that there's a mixture of form and function that we have to pay attention to. So it's a mixture of not only changing beliefs and mindsets, but we do have to pay attention to those systems and structures as well, so that we can open up new ways of how our public administration operates.
Because it's those systems and structures that present one of the really big obstacles, right? And we've always done it this way, so we should keep doing it this way. And it seems to me that what all three of you are talking about is quite a radical shift that needs to happen really at the top of government, I guess. What are the obstacles, Catherine, do you think, to change happening?
Well, I think, there is a certain level of politics that perhaps we need to readdress. And I mean, that's really coming to the fore with the lack of trust. But what are we finding in this new era with COVID is whether trust will get re-established or not. A large part of that is actually thanks to some expertise that's being brought back into the system. So I think if I talk to the public administration arm, which I'm really quite passionate about in terms of the public service as an institution and an entity, that was created in a particular time and space under Max Weber in the 1800s. It was designed extremely effectively for that time and to address large-scale mass population needs. So I don't think we should get rid of it. It does amazing things and it can be very flexible. But Jeff Mulgan's work from Nesta and from the work that he does at Thea knows very well is he talks about the government does work with, to and for communities. And so the current structure of the public service deals really well in doing work to and for the public. But in this area of working with communities, I don't think our public service as an institution is designed yet to be able to deliver effectively in that space. So we need to move beyond a single paradigm of what it means to be a public service to multiple paradigms actually to cater to those different areas. So education, health, justice, those particular areas where we need to work so closely with communities. I don't think our public service is yet fit for purpose for that because it's designed from something from a time past.
Thank you, Catherine. There's been a lot of interest in question 3, which is a big one. How can a reimagining of government help us to address the great challenges of our time? And we know those challenges seem at times insuperable: climate change, inequality within countries, between countries. Terry, I'm really interested to hear your thoughts on this. Recently, late last year, you gave the John Cain oration and you talked about the role of delivery of government services at the local level and how you see that as an opportunity to reinvent government. Can you take us through a couple of things? One is, why did you come to that thought? How did you develop that thought? And what is the relationship between those huge questions that question 3 is putting forward and the sort of delivery of services at the local level, which of course is the small level? So I guess that goes to the question of the relationship between a national government, say in Australia, and a government at the local level, which obviously is closer on the ground, but doesn't have the reach that a national government might have.
Well, James, doing things at the local level is okay for certain areas of welfare and health delivery, but there are a whole lot of other things that go on inside government. And the biggest problem that we've got is that we've assumed that the national home, or the natural home for anything that's important, is in a traditional Department of State. And basically, they're not working very well. If you look at the Commonwealth public service, the formal public service is less than half the total number of Commonwealth employees, because all the rest are in independent agencies, large and small, the RBA, the ABC, the Defence Forces, the AFP. And all of these agencies generally are well known in the public and are respected. And so the old Sir Humphrey impetus to get stuff inside the Department of State where it's controlled by the Secretary, who in turn responds to the whims and wishes of a minister, just doesn't get you good results. And in Victoria, the ratio of public servants to total public sector employment is even more skewed in favour of broader public sector employment in hospitals, in schools, all sorts of agencies. So we have to get away from the notion that politicians being directly accountable for service delivery is a good thing. And I'll give you one example. The Commonwealth's got the Clean Energy Finance Corporation. It's chaired by and has a board made up of people from the private sector, mainly from the financial services sector, and all its senior people are essentially people with private sector experience. But they're established under legislation, they have a mandate, they're strictly accountable to government, but they have discretion to get on and make some sometimes risky choices, and in doing that, overall deliver a positive return for their investments in companies that can move us in the direction of new technologies for energy and its delivery. And this is a great story which has escaped many of the people in Canberra who otherwise operate grants-based systems to put stuff out there in the hope that something will happen, or try to use the tax system to provide incentives. So I think that we've got to get ministers around to the view that trying to control all the detail of things usually is a disaster, and public servants to recognise that their colleagues in big agencies like the RBA, the ABC and all the others that I mentioned, they're actually more highly valued and admired by the public than we public servants are.
Thanks, Terry. Thea, I'd like you to reflect on what Terry's just said. And I'm still interested in this idea of the size of the change we're talking about here. And I wonder if you think, what would be the drivers of a change like this? Are we in a position now where such change is really on the table? Is government at this point, do you think? Or do you think we have a long way to go before a change of this size, where we, in effect, rework the relationships between, on a subsidiarity principle, on a principle of driving decision-making down to a lower level, but of course maintaining the central role of the national government, say in a country like Australia as well, and working out that balance. What needs to change, do you think, within government and within the society at large to make this a realistic menu of reform?
Well, I'll start by saying that this is the first conversation I've been in a long time where COVID hasn't been mentioned for almost half an hour, but I'm about to mention it, so I've just ruined that. Because I think that actually, the catalyst for having this conversation at this point in time was COVID, because it really is forcing everyone in every field around the world to confront a very different world. And I think that for me, in terms of sort of change and how do we make change happen, there are two different kinds of change that I think about. And there's a concept called the 3 Horizons framework by Bill Sharp, where he talks about sort of the first horizon is no change. The second horizon is changes to the existing system. And then third horizon changes are changes to the system itself. And there are relationships between those different types of change. And the first article that I wrote, which sort of triggered this series, was about that third horizon change. So big system change. And there's some really interesting literature in public administration theory and more generally around paradigm shift and what drives paradigm shift. And it's often critical junctures or critical moments that create an opportunity for quite radical change. And to quote another person who I really, her writing I admire enormously as well, Donella Meadows, speaks about paradigm shift. And she says that the way that paradigms shift is that there's a moment, a juncture like COVID, people start to point out the deficits and the shortcomings in the current system, which is what I think we're all doing, and Terry just did so well just then. And also there's an alternative set of ideas that's put forward as a different option. And you build a coalition of interested and willing people who are passionate about taking that idea forward. And that was really the catalyst for this conversation. We need to be building this alternative vision and finding the coalition of people who want to take it forward. That's sort of the third horizon level, but also we're seeing some really quite profound changes in government at the second horizon level as well, which have happened really fast. So government agencies, which have traditionally operated in silos, all of a sudden coming together and working really collaboratively with partners outside of government. So doctors and hospitals and manufacturers, everyone's sort of coming together, government's working quickly. Leaders, politicians are saying we don't have all the answers. And so we're seeing these new trends emerging, which are what we've been sort of wanting, and COVID's been the catalyst for that. So then the question becomes, what do we do? How do we make this change stick? How do we use this momentum and this moment to really, I guess, not only reveal what's possible, but start thinking about how we embed the changes, the positive changes that we've seen emerging from what has been a terrible experience for a lot of people. And it's important to acknowledge that, but also an opportunity.
I think that's a fascinating point you just made, Thea. And how do we make the changes that we see as beneficial stick? And in fact, that's a great period for us to move into groups. We're now going to divide, Chris is now going to divide all of you, all the participants into groups, and you're going to chat for about 10 to 12 minutes. So I think we'll now come back to the panel, and I'd like to ask Catherine. Perhaps Catherine, you can tell us a bit about what your group discussed. But I think one question that we didn't get to, and I think we should focus the last 20 minutes or so, is how we align the sort of reforms we've been talking about tonight with the standard priorities, risk aversion of government, and the things that government has to do every day. What's a theory of change to take these examples into mainstream practice in government? Is that what your group was talking about? It'd be really interesting to hear from you about that process.
Sure. Thanks, James. So I had a delightful conversation with Sam Hanna-Rankin, who heads up innovation work in Victoria. So we were able to catch up personally, which was great too, because we know each other. So that was wonderful. But
yeah.
But I think we're chatting a little bit actually about the comeback to work post sort of the physical distancing requirements with COVID, and what will that mean? So it brought to my mind, the politicians know the adage well that never waste a good crisis. And, this is certainly an opportunity, not to put too light a word on it, in terms of for all of us, as Thea was talking about, as Terry mentioned, there's so many opportunities for us to do things better with our existing systems, but to also look beyond it, how we can make system change. I can't get beyond the fact, as somebody who studied politics and economics, that we're basically, in order to get effect to do change, we have to pay attention to economics. We have to pay attention to power. So money and power are really important in this. I'm sure Terry will probably offer some interesting observations in terms of how we might imagine a new form of economics. So Mariana Mazzucato's work, of course, many people already are aware of that in terms of how we conceive of the notion of value in different ways. In that area, I'm particularly struck by work that has been happening in Bhutan, where they have shifted the gross national product measurement to gross happiness index. And, what does that mean? How can we make that concrete? How can we start to pay attention to those intergenerational environmental issues alongside of economics and politics? So I think there's some serious work that needs to happen. It won't be quick. It won't be easy. But in the COVID environment, if we take the optimism that Thea has in terms of how we can take advantage of this particular time when the whole of the world is paying attention to how we might want to prioritise what we do and what we value, then that's at least a start for us.
Terry, let me take Catherine's invitation for you to comment about economists. I once heard you say that economists wielded a lot of power in Canberra in your time, and in part you explained that they had a theory of change and how the world worked when other professions had abandoned that sort of universal thinking. Tell us about the role of economists in wielding power, and perhaps are they part of the solution as well as the problem? And perhaps you might then go more broadly to tell us how you see the sort of change that people are talking about in the chats, how that becomes a steady state rather than just bright spots in an otherwise grey landscape.
Has read Hermann Hesse's The Glass Bead Game, but it always seemed to me that economists were like the priestly caste that played the glass bead game. Totally abstract, unrelated to anything that was real, and although highly regarded in society, didn't take anybody anywhere except for the priestly caste that was able to sustain a decent life by being of that sort. Now, that's a bit harsh if translated to the world of economics, but we had a huge period of change driven by economics principally from the early 80s through for the next 20 or so years, the second big period of reform since the Second World War. The game's up. A lot of useful things that were done, but a lot of bad things were also introduced that haven't been corrected. And economists have got to get serious about evaluation, serious about criticism of the consequences of what they do, and show a bit of humility in realising that you can't just throw it all into a market and hope for the best. You've also got to think about, well, how the organisation is going to work? How are we going to hold them accountable? How do you give the clients of a particular service some rights? And so there has to be a big debate about a new style of managing the delivery of government services and getting as much of it out of the hands of ministers as possible.
Can I ask you quickly, Thea talked a bit about history, the big shifts that have happened over time, and Hilary Cotton, whom she has mentioned, talks about Beveridge in the 1940s in Britain writing a report that led to the institution of the welfare state and the creation of a lot of good service delivery, but also a lot of big bureaucracy that ended up doing things to citizens rather than with them. Do you think, Terry, that we're on the verge of some sort of seismic change? I mean, that came out of World War II, the Great Depression, a period of just massive social and all change of all kinds. Are we on the brink of the sort of change now that would lead to a dramatic reinvention and a reimagining of government for the 21st century? Are the drivers there?
Yeah, well, my view is that apart from what I said about the source of policy in economics, we're halfway there. We've got a mixed system. We've got lots of organisations that have a degree of independence to take risks, to spend budgets according to agreed approaches, and deliver results. And where that's happened in government, you typically find that the delivery of services is more efficient and better regarded than in areas where mainstream departments of state in all their grandeur seek to control things at the local level, although they never get out and see much at the local level. It just doesn't work. So I think we've just got to be quite honest and admit that the current approach to government, if you seriously are on about greatly improved delivery, has got to get over the nonsense ideology of the Reagan-Thatcher period and what it said about the public sector, which was a means of denigrating the public sector and reducing its confidence, and build further the systems we've already got for putting resources, accountability, and a sense of strategic direction out there to delivery agencies who, in most cases, after a while, do a better job than the mainstream departments of state, frankly.
Thanks, Terry. Thea, can we just have a very quick thought from you on what you heard Catherine and Terry say and what you discussed in your chat room?
Yeah, so I'm just going to talk because I'm conscious of time and I want people to be able to jump off at 6. So I'm just going to very quickly share one really lovely thing that came out of our chat, which was a really tangible example of having different kinds of conversations. And I'm not going to say who because Chatham House rules, but someone from local government spoke about her experience working with a local community that was known to be a difficult community. And she said she was new to government. So she just like went and sat in the pub with that community and just chatted to them, you know, had just a chat. And at the end of an hour and a couple of drinks, they said, but you haven't even asked us the questions, you know, you haven't asked us the questions that the government always asks us. And she's like, well, that's not important to me. And over the course of 18 months, by having different kinds of conversations, she has completely shifted, it sounds like, the dynamic and the perception that these people have of government. And I think that was just, for me, that's exactly the kind of micro innovation. You know, there's stuff that needs to happen at the macro level, which is sort of what Terry and Catherine have been speaking about. But I think at the micro level, the little shifts, the different conversations, the different sort of mindsets that people are bringing to their work can also be incredibly powerful in driving change from the bottom up as well as from the top down.
Thanks, Thea. So let's in the last 15 minutes that we have, talk about the difficulties. Can we talk about risk a bit? Risk drives government, doesn't it, Terry? Isn't there we've been talking about these ideas for 20 years in a way that government needs to put itself at a lower level, closer to citizens. It needs to open up its information and data banks for citizens to use. Sometimes I worry that the rhetoric outruns the reality significantly. Is risk something that can eventually be overcome? You know, the fear that in an adversarial system, something that happens at the local level will end up on page 1 of the paper, and that won't be good. How do you see the problem of risk within government and overcoming it so that experiments that might fail can be tried sometimes, because that's how we learn?
Well, ministers don't have to accept all risks. They've got to take political risks on a large scale. They've got to take risks about judgment of the economics of budgets and what's put out there. They've got to take risks when they consider what can be legislated by means of empowering others to do things. But the key to good public administration now is how do you take as much risk away from a minister's desk and deposit it outside of Department of State, because they're all accountable to a minister, and you've got to acknowledge the minister has some responsibility, and into an independent entity. But when I was Secretary of the Premier's Department, I can recall there was a significant public hospital where something that shouldn't have been done was done, and it was unfortunate. And it could have landed on the minister's desk, but it actually belonged on the desk of the chair of the board and the CEO, and the minister made it plain to those people that it was theirs to carry, and there were heads taken at the level of the hospital, and the problem was remedied. Now, if you're in a Department of State that operates in a detailed way what goes on in hospitals, which is the case in some other states, well, you can't do that. But if you've got an intermediary layer of governance accountability, ministers can focus on the big issues and do the big plays rather than being dragged down by fear of the minor things that can distract you.
It's really interesting. It's definitely a new paradigm. Catherine, I'd like to bring it to the APS if we can. You've looked at the APS closely in your paper with Carmel McGregor. And you talk about these, you tackle these questions head on in that paper. Could you talk a bit about the potential within the APS to move on these questions and the obstacles? It's not you're quite frank in that paper about the difficulties that exist within the APS to affect the sort of transformative change we're talking about. It'd be great to hear from you about what it looks like to you on the ground.
Sure. So I think that some of the things that Carmel and I identified, speaking to a whole range of people across the APS and beyond, was we need to move away from thinking about things as service delivery. And we really need to truly talk about empowering communities. So that does require a different way of not only talking about what we're wanting to achieve with sharing power, but actually delivering on that very tangibly. And I think we sort of hinted at it in the paper, but couldn't really go into it in a lot of detail, which was that I think we're stuck in our theory of representation in our political system. Terry's, helpfully pointed out how we've got a particular form or system of governance which places a lot of power with the minister, and that's a single representative for many, many people. And yet the public service plays a very significant role and can play more of a significant role in terms of assisting political actors to be more representative, actually, of what is needed in different communities. So if anything, we believe that there is a role for a new set of ideas in the area of representation. Too often we just say it's inappropriate for public servants to exercise discretion, and yet we know that it's the frontline delivery workers, the police, the nurses, the teachers, who are actually very trusted by communities. We need to take advantage of that, and we need to be able to empower them in different ways and say that discretion in particular forms and with particular parameters is actually a good thing for politicians and not something to be feared. So I think we need to harness representation in new ways.
Let's talk, Catherine, can you talk a little bit about the Indigenous policy landscape? It's probably been 20 years that we've read reports saying, the way to move forward is to empower Indigenous communities, for them to have say in the decisions that affect them. I've read so many reports on that. You talk about it in your paper. Is there, and yet the same mistakes seem being made over and over again. There's changes, a new lot comes in, they start doing everything all over, reinventing the wheel. Where are we with Indigenous policy? Are we still just going around in circles, or are there genuine attempts now to wrestle with all the challenges of bringing decision making down to the ground level?
Well, I'll speak as a non-Indigenous woman here. And I think you're absolutely right. I mean, it's a pretty bleak picture if you take the state of Indigenous affairs in terms of Australia and indeed for New Zealand, Aotearoa New Zealand, because we're not seeing the outcomes. And it's not as if the recipes for success have not been given to us over many, many reports, many, many times and years. So that's pretty frustrating, obviously, for First Peoples and for people who are interested, who are non-Indigenous, who want to see change happen. Positive change happen. But I think, in order to give effect to the serious change that has been, sought for many years, we need to take seriously that shifting of control and power. So, there's lots of scope for positive change there in terms of activities that are happening. We can take notice of what's happening in the New Zealand landscape there in terms of taking the treaty quite seriously. So we're starting to see a bit of a wellspring of positive change happen in the Australian scene in that regard. But of course, there's many, many questions there in terms of whether treaty is the right way to go. And this is a question that First Peoples themselves across Australia need to wrestle with and come up with their own solutions, community by community, nation by nation. So I think the difficult thing for modern government is that we tend to treat First Peoples as a homogenous group instead of treating them as separate nations with their own identities and cultures. So for governments to do that, that takes a new way of thinking of how we deal with diversity. So there'll need to be changes that happen there. But I'd put a call out for all the Indigenous public servants who are actually operating already in government, who are making huge changes and exercising a very practical, very different way of exercising leadership as a public servant, one that goes beyond that notion of representation that I talked about before, because they are serving their communities in incredibly fulsome ways and yet simultaneously serving the minister and the political system that we operate in. And their ability to do that is absolutely incredible and one that we should be taking more notice of.
Could I add a postscript to what has just been said?
Please do.
I was Director General of Education for Queensland in the late 90s. And in that role, I decided to do a review of Indigenous education, and as part of that went to Cape York. And two things struck me about Cape York at that time. One, plane loads of public servants from different departments and agencies would come in for their monthly or 2-monthly visit and purport to do business on that basis. There was no coordination. And frankly, the Commonwealth was as bad on that score as the state was. Secondly, this is when I first met Noel Pearson, and what became Noel's idea of empowered communities developed through the Jarwin organisation that has been operating in Cape York for decades, was actually the beginning of the thinking about how do we deal with communities and the services they need, for instance, employment services and all that goes with it, so that we get a more successful approach, not dependent upon a tight line into Spring Street or Canberra. And the problem that Noel has had in getting any concessions out of government so that he could pursue empowered communities as an approach were frankly, they've just been disgraceful over a period of time. I don't think we'll have the same problem with the sort of approach that I mentioned in Wyndham, because ministers got involved at an early stage. I think state and federal ministers liked it. They want to roll it out. And now the Centre for Policy Development with BCG is developing a whole model for how you could do it at scale. So if we get it right, and if people want to roll it out, I just hope that everybody's disciplined about doing all the things that need to be done.
Thanks, Terry. Just before I throw to Thea to finish our webinar, I just want to raise some couple of really interesting things that have come up in the chat. There's a lot of discussion about the power and the importance of storytelling and narrative. I think both to move this discussion along, it's the stories we tell. I looked at Hilary Cotham's TED Talk the other day. It's a brilliant talk about what she has done in Southwark in south of London, and she tells stories. She uses it to tell stories of individuals and how a new government paradigm has changed their lives. And so that's obviously something that is resonating with people in this webinar tonight. And related to that is the importance of trust and relationships and building those over time. Thea, that might be a good point to throw to you. I think over the course of the next 5 webinars, we need to go in more deeply, and we need to be, sort of candid and skeptical about the obstacles that lie ahead of us in this journey of reimagining government. But for now, why don't you tell us a bit about your work looking at those issues of relationships building, of building trust, and why that matters so much in terms of reimagining government. And if you wish to reflect on what Catherine and Terry said as well, please do so.
Thanks, James. So I think I just did want to pick up on one thread around risk. And I think that risk is a huge roadblock for this kind of new operating model. But at the same time, risk is much greater in a traditional expression of government, where public servants sit down, design, spend 6 months designing a strategy that sort of spans 10 years, that predicts that certain interventions will lead to certain outcomes, because then you can fail, right? You've set yourself up to fail, because that's not how things work. The world is complex, and every intervention triggers a stream of ripples, which then means that you need to reassess what you did. And so what we need is a much more agile and adaptive form of government that learns as it goes. And in a way, if you move away from that version of government where you design a plan, you predict what's going to happen, you say this intervention will lead to that, then risk and failure sort of become less of an issue, because you actually go in and you test things, you prototype, you adjust and you learn. And it's through this experimentation and learning that we at CPI really feel that progress is made, and in a way that does away with that sort of there are still risks and it requires a very different mindset, but it does away with that sort of, we designed a policy and it failed type of scenario.
Thanks, there. And I imagine the Centre for Public Impact will continue to be doing work in this field. And part of your role and part of ANZOG's role and of other organisations is to change that narrative, to tell those stories and give examples of success. We're out of time, everybody, but please come back in 2 weeks. Keep your questions, and thank you all for your participation tonight, for your contributions. So once again, thank you all for coming, and see you in 2 weeks when we look at systems thinking with Adrian Brown, Luke Craven and Deborah Blackman. Thanks everybody, and good night.